Walking to work again this morning. The sunrise just starting to come up over the mountains behind me. Those mountains look a lot smaller in pictures and videos, on a phone at least, than they are. They're pretty imposing in person. So yeah, anyways, I'm walking to work early in the morning. It's about 5:40, and as I'm walking, I'm thinking about the post that I made looking at Jill Lepore's The Name of War, which is an examination of the literature surrounding King Philip's War. King Philip's War is a war that takes place in 1676, 1677 in Massachusetts, between Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and their indigenous allies, fighting against the Wampanoag and Narragansett indigenous people who are resisting land encroachment and cultural encroachment, and also resisting their displacement in the kind of intercultural spheres of influence that have been developing. Wampanoags seem to have this growing feeling that they are being dismissed, and preferential treatment is being given to Indians who have been baptized, Christian Indians, praying Indians. So it's not, necessarily just this war about us versus them in a strict sense of that meaning, or the way that's often used. It, in some ways, it's about this fight for who gets what kind of treatment within this intercultural space, this sort of, one historian has written a book calling it a civil war, that it's not, we shouldn't see it as in the same way that we would see an international conflict, but a conflict within the same society. So anyways, she writes this book about literary treatments, colonial literary treatments of the war. And basically her thesis is that the colonial treatments of the war, the English written accounts and histories during and after the war, perform the same function as ritual ceremonial torture does when Native Americans perform that torture on their captured enemies. The purpose of it is to transform the captive being tortured into a vehicle for taking on the pain and suffering and grief and fear, anxiety of the people who are still living. And through the ritualized torture, the world is put back aright, set back in order, and peace can flourish again. So I in my Substack post, I compared, I think compared is a loosely applied term for what I did. I talked about what Lepore is doing, and then I just threw in Ernst Cassirer. and without much explanation, without much overview of who Cassirer is and why he matters and why anybody should care, why Ernst Cassirer relates to what Jill Lepore is doing. Ernst Cassirer is a late 19th, early 20th century Jewish German philosopher, relatively obscure these days. I don't think very many people read or study him anymore. If there ever really was a great number of them that did. I'm not sure. I don't know whether Jill Lepore has ever read Ernst Cassirer, but she should, because his philosophy very much relates to what she's doing in this book, The Name of War. And I think Americans in general should take an interest in Ernst Cassirer, at least in an indirect way. Ernst Cassirer was the dissertation supervisor for Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss is probably one of the most important political philosophers in American history. Has an outsized influence, really, because of who his students were. You know, people like Allen Bloom, and then who his students were. You know, so Ernst Cassirer is an important but unconsidered, unstudied figure. And you know, I'm no expert on Cassirer, but in a nutshell, what I've gleaned from the little bit I've read of him is this philosophy of language as a creative act that is also determined by what it's creating. And I don't know how much Cassirer sees it that way. He comes across at times as very Hegelian, very Kantian, and so I would say very idealistic. He's also difficult to access in some ways because in his writing, Cassirer uses a lot of quotations. He's quoting other people. He's explaining other people's philosophy, and that can make it hard to understand what Cassirer is saying, because he often uses these other philosophers and their words as a form of ventriloquism. Also, almost, Cassirer speaks through the quotations that he uses, but he doesn't make that clear. So Cassirer sees language as this creative act. The way to think about it would be thinking about Plato's Forms, where what Cassirer is saying is that language speaks something into creation, and also speaks into creation the system for interpreting the thing that it speaks. So like Plato's Forms, where we create a version of something, and that version symbolizes this ideal, this idealized form that represents the perfect version. And we can never speak the perfect version, we can never create the perfect version, but the perfect version is referencing, or the created version is referencing the perfect version. And that's kind of a simplistic way of putting it, I think. So there's probably a lot people could say about that, but this seems to be the way that Cassirer is understanding language, that a spoken word speaks, attaches meaning to a thing, but then also creates the system through which you understand the thing that you're symbolizing with. And so for Kassir, there's this unbreakable bond between the particular, or the signifier, the symbol, and the whole, or the system, or the language. The word attaches meaning to a specific thing, but also creates the language through which you understand the specific thing. And these are happening simultaneously, and they are happening spontaneously. The tension, I think, seems to be that for Kassir, the system needs to be understood in order to understand the signifier, the symbol. So in order to understand the word, you have to understand the language. Would be a kind of a simple way of putting it. And so a word can only symbolize, can only have meaning within the system of language that it's communicating through. So the problem that I see with that, and I'm not sure if Kassir recognizes, because he's very Kantian and Hegelian and therefore very idealistic, and he seems to imagine these perfect systems for understanding symbols in the way that Hegel and Kant and Plato do. So the problem is that there are no perfect systems, you know. These systems borrow from each other and co-opt meaning from each other, use each other in order to express things that their system hasn't developed a means of expressing. This is something that Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, points to when he talks about myth, and how because we see the repetition of myths or mythic symbols across cultures, doesn't mean that we should take it that these myths are, or these cultures are borrowing meaning from each other. So what that means is, just because you see, for example, the motif of the hero's journey across cultures, it doesn't mean that we should assume that there's an original hero's journey motif that's being replicated across cultures, and that they're in the sense of like a diaspora or a genealogy of meaning. What Boas says is that we should understand that these cultures are borrowing the symbol, but not the meaning attached to that symbol. And so the culture that borrows a mythic symbol from another doesn't really care how that mythic symbol functions within its context of origin. All that it cares about is that it can function within the borrowing context to express meaning in a way that culture is still working out. And so language does this, you know. We speak, and the novel thing I think that Kassir provides in his philosophy of language is that when you are speaking, you are recreating, but also creating. So the system is being reinvented and reformed, remolded with each instance of the use of language. So the point is that the rigidity that we impose on linguistic systems is imposed. It's a false rigidity. They are not rigid at all. They are very much fluid and malleable, and being shaped and reshaping, being invented and reinventing with each new occurrence of that system. So Kassir would also say that language is the basis of all human understanding. All human cognitive process begins with language. And so everything is that way. Everything that humans create, our social systems, our cultures, our laws, just everything is shaping itself as it is shaped by itself, which is really maybe not clearing anything up, but I have time to blab incomprehensibly about this stuff as I'm walking to work, getting out of breath, trying to walk fast, and hopefully this makes some sense. I'd love to hear what people think, if anybody has any thoughts.